The morning sun broke through the grey London clouds just as the royal convoy began its journey toward Westminster Abbey. Inside the state car, Catherine straightened her gloves for what felt like the 100th time. William noticed the small gesture and reached over to gently place his hand on hers. The streets were already packed with people who had camped overnight, their faces pressed against the barriers as they waited for a glimpse of the future king and queen. Some had traveled from across the world, holding flags and homemade signs. The energy in the air was electric, a mixture of excitement and reverence that only such historic moments could create. Catherine took a deep breath and looked out the window. Thousands of eyes would soon be on her. Cameras would capture every step, every smile, every moment. She had prepared for this day for years, yet the reality of it felt overwhelming. This was not just another royal engagement. This was the coronation of King Charles III, and she and William would play a central role in the ancient ceremony. William squeezed her hand. He understood the weight she carried. After all, he had grown up watching his own mother navigate the relentless spotlight, the expectations, the scrutiny. He had seen how it could break a person if they let it. But Catherine was different. She had a quiet strength that had drawn him to her all those years ago at university. The car slowed as they approached the final stretch. Through the windows they could see the magnificent facade of Westminster Abbey, its Gothic towers reaching toward the sky. The building had witnessed centuries of royal history, from coronations to weddings to funerals. Today, it would witness another chapter. Security personnel lined the route, their faces serious and alert. Behind them, the crowd grew denser, their cheers becoming louder as the royal car drew nearer. Children sat on their parents' shoulders waving small Union Jack flags. Elderly women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs, moved by the significance of the moment. Inside the car, Catherine closed her eyes briefly and thought of her children. George, Charlotte, and Louis were already at the Abbey with other family members. She hoped George was handling the pressure well. At his young age, he already understood that his life would be different from other children's. Today would reinforce that reality in ways a child could barely comprehend. The car finally came to a stop. Outside, the roar of the crowd became a physical force. William looked at his wife and saw the woman he had chosen to stand beside him for life. She wore an elegant ivory gown designed by Sarah Burton, the same designer who had created her wedding dress years before. The choice was deliberate, a nod to continuity and the journey they had shared together. A royal aide opened the door, and the sound of the crowd flooded in. William stepped out first, his military uniform crisp and decorated with medals and honors. He turned and offered his hand to Catherine. As she emerged from the car, a collective gasp rose from the onlookers. The early morning light caught the intricate embroidery on her dress, making it shimmer. On her head sat a delicate diamond tiara that had belonged to the late Queen Elizabeth II. Catherine had specifically requested to wear this piece as a tribute to the grandmother figure who had guided her through the complexities of royal life. They paused at the bottom of the steps leading to the Abbey's entrance. This was the moment. Photographers had positioned themselves hours earlier to capture. William and Catherine stood together, hand in hand, looking up at the ancient doors that would soon open before them. The crowd's cheers reached a crescendo. People were crying openly now, overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment. This was not just about pageantry or tradition. This was about continuity, about a nation finding hope in the faces of two people who represented both history and the future. Catherine felt William's thumb gently stroke the back of her hand. It was a small gesture, invisible to the cameras, but it meant everything. In that touch, she felt his support, his love, his acknowledgement that they were in this together. Whatever came next, they would face it as partners. They began to climb the steps. Each footfall echoed with purpose. Catherine kept her head high, her expression serene, even as her heart pounded in her chest. She had been trained for moments like this, taught to never let the mask slip, to always present grace and composure to the world. But inside, she was still Kate Middleton from Berkshire, the girl who had grown up in a normal family, who had played sports and laughed with friends and dreamed of a life that looked nothing like this. Sometimes the distance between who she had been and who she had become felt impossibly vast. At the top of the steps, they were greeted by the Archbishop of Canterbury. His ceremonial robes were elaborate, heavy with gold thread and ancient symbolism. He bowed slightly to them, a sign of respect that felt surreal even after all these years. William returned the gesture with a small nod. Before entering the abbey, Catherine turned back one last time to look at the crowd. From this vantage point, she could see the full scale of the gathering. People stretched as far as her eyes could see, a sea of faces and flags and cameras. Somewhere in that crowd were people who had supported them through scandals and celebrations, who had defended them against criticism, who had invested emotionally in their love story. She raised her hand in a small wave. The gesture was instinctive, unplanned, and it sparked another wave of cheers. William smiled at her spontaneity. This was one of the things he loved about her ability to connect with people in genuine moments, to remember that beyond the protocol and the ceremony, there were real human beings watching and hoping and caring. They turned together and crossed the threshold into Westminster Abbey. The temperature dropped immediately, the ancient stone walls holding centuries of cool air. The sound of the crowd faded, replaced by the solemn notes of the organ and the hushed whispers of the assembled guests. Inside, 2,000 people waited. World leaders, foreign royalty, military officials, religious figures, and representatives from charities and organizations across the Commonwealth. Every eye turned as William and Catherine made their entrance. The aisle stretched before them like a path through history. Catherine could see her children in their designated seats, George looking so grown up in his formal attire. Charlotte gave her mother a small, brave smile. Louis wiggled slightly but was kept in check by a gentle hand from his attendant. William felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. His father was about to be crowned king, and with that coronation came a reshuffling of roles and responsibilities. William would formally become the Prince of Wales, heir to the throne. Catherine would become the Princess of Wales, a title that carried its own complicated legacy. They walked slowly down the aisle, their steps measured and deliberate. The abbey's interior was breathtaking, decorated with thousands of flowers that had been arranged overnight. White roses, lilies, and seasonal blooms created cascading displays that seemed to defy gravity. The scent was subtle but present, a reminder of life and beauty amid all the formality. Catherine noticed familiar faces as they passed. There was her sister Pippa, looking elegant and supportive. Her parents sat nearby, their expressions a mixture of pride and wonder. Michael and Carol Middleton had come so far from their humble beginnings, and now they sat among royalty and world leaders, watching their daughter walk toward a destiny few could have imagined. William caught sight of his brother Harry in the crowd. Their relationship had been strained in recent years, complicated by distance and different choices. But today was not about their differences. Today was about family, about the institution they both belonged to, whether they lived within its boundaries or not. Harry gave a small nod and William returned it. Perhaps there would be time later for conversation, for bridge building. Or perhaps this nod was all they could manage for now. The music swelled as they reached their designated seats. These were not just any seats, but specially prepared thrones positioned to give them a clear view of the ceremony, while allowing the cameras to capture their reactions. Every aspect had been planned months in advance, choreographed down to the second. As they sat, Catherine adjusted her dress carefully. The fabric was heavy, designed to photograph beautifully but challenging to manage in reality. She had practiced sitting and standing in it dozens of times, but the actual moment always felt different from rehearsal. King Charles entered from a side door, and the entire abbey rose as one. He looked regal in his ceremonial robes, but Catherine could see the emotion in his face. This was the role he had waited his entire life to assume. He had been the longest-serving heir in British history, and now, at an age when most people were retired, he was finally stepping into the position he was born for. Beside him walked Camilla, soon to be queen consort. Their journey had been controversial, marked by public scrutiny and criticism. But time had softened opinions, and many now saw the genuine affection between them, the way they supported each other through the endless demands of royal duty. The ceremony began with ancient words spoken in solemn tones. The archbishop's voice echoed through the abbey. carrying traditions that stretched back over 1,000 years. This was not a modern invention, but a ritual that connected the present to countless generations past. Kings and queens had been crowned in this very spot since William the Conqueror in 1066. Catherine watched as various nobles approached the king, each playing their role in the elaborate ceremony. The regalia was brought forward piece by piece, the sovereign's orb, representing Christ's dominion over the world, the scepter with the cross symbolizing the monarch's temporal power, the rod of equity and mercy, showing the balance a ruler must maintain. Each item had its own history, its own story. Some pieces were centuries old, handled by dozens of monarchs throughout British history. The weight of that continuity was almost tangible in the air. When the moment came for the actual crowning, a profound silence fell over the abbey. 2,000 people held their breath collectively. Outside, the crowds in the streets stopped their chatter. Across the nation and around the world, millions watched on television screens, all focused on this single moment. The Archbishop lifted St. Edward's crown, the centerpiece of the crown jewels. Made of solid gold and set with precious stones, it weighed nearly 5 pounds. Charles bowed his head slightly as the crown was lowered onto his head. In that instant, he transformed from prince to king in the fullest ceremonial sense. Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them away quickly, aware that cameras were likely capturing her reaction. But the emotion was real and powerful. This was her father-in-law, a man she had come to know and respect, taking on a burden that would be his until death. There was something both magnificent and heartbreaking about that reality. William reached over and briefly touched her hand. His face remained stoic, properly formal for the cameras, but she knew he was feeling the same complex emotions. This was his father being crowned, but it was also a preview of his own future. One day William would sit where Charles sat now. One day a crown would be placed on his head. And Catherine would sit beside him, crowned as queen consort. The ceremony continued with oaths and prayers, with music and processions. Various dignitaries came forward to pay homage to the new king. Representatives from across the Commonwealth acknowledged his sovereignty. The spectacle was grand, almost overwhelming in its magnificence. Charlotte leaned forward slightly in her seat, her young eyes wide with wonder. She was watching her grandfather become king, absorbing images and moments that would stay with her forever. Louis had grown restless and was being quietly managed by his caretaker, but even he seemed to sense that something important was happening. George sat very still, his young face serious. He understood more than his siblings. He knew that the crown being placed on his grandfather's head represented a path that led eventually to him. The weight of that knowledge showed in his posture, in the careful way he maintained his composure. Catherine's heart ached for him. He was so young to carry such awareness. She and William had tried to give their children as normal a childhood as possible. But moments like this made the impossibility of that goal painfully clear. George's future was not his own to choose. It had been decided by birth, by history, by forces far beyond anyone's control. When Camilla was crowned as queen consort, there was a noticeable shift in the abbey's atmosphere. This moment was more controversial, more fraught with complicated history. But Camilla held herself with dignity as a modified crown was placed on her head. She had earned her place through years of service and commitment, and today that was being formally recognized. The congregation sang "God Save the King" for the first time in over 70 years. The change from queen to king was jarring for those old enough to remember decades of Elizabeth II's reign. But it was also right, proper, the natural order of succession playing out as it had countless times before. As the final notes faded, Charles stood, now fully crowned and robed in his full regalia. He looked out over the assembled crowd, his expression a mixture of solemnity and determination. This was his moment, his time to lead. Everything that had come before was preparation. Everything that came after would be legacy. William and Catherine stood with the rest of the congregation as the newly crowned king and queen prepared to exit the abbey. The procession out would be longer and more elaborate than the entrance, a chance for the public to see their monarch in full ceremonial glory. As they prepared to follow in the procession, Catherine took one last look around the abbey. This building had witnessed so much of royal history. She had been married here, watched friends and family wed within these walls, and now she had witnessed a coronation, a moment she would carry with her always. The procession began to form outside the abbey. The newly crowned King Charles and Queen Camilla would travel in the Gold State Coach, an ornate vehicle that had carried monarchs since 1762. William and Catherine would follow in a separate carriage, their position in the procession reflecting their status as heir and future queen consort. As they emerged from the abbey, the roar of the crowd was deafening. The earlier cheers paled in comparison to this eruption of sound. People were crying, cheering, waving flags with wild enthusiasm. Some had been waiting for over 24 hours for this moment, and their excitement was unleashed in waves of sound that seemed to shake the very air. Catherine paused at the top of the steps, taking in the scene before her. The mall stretched out in the distance, lined with thousands upon thousands of people. Union Jack flags created a sea of red, white, and blue. Confetti was already beginning to fall from buildings, despite strict regulations against such things. The joy was spontaneous and impossible to contain. William guided her toward their carriage with a gentle hand on the small of her back. The gesture was subtle but protective, a reminder that they were partners in all of this. The carriage waiting for them was beautiful, gilded and polished to perfection. Footmen in elaborate livery stood at attention, ready to assist them. Getting into the carriage with her formal gown required careful maneuvering. Catherine had practiced this as well, but the reality was still challenging. The dress was heavy and cumbersome, and the carriage steps were narrow. She managed it with grace, though she was grateful for the footman's steady hand. William climbed in beside her and the door was closed. For a brief moment they were alone together, separated from the world by glass and ceremony. The interior of the carriage smelled of leather and history. How many royals had sat in this very spot, traveling this same route for momentous occasions? The procession began to move. The horses pulling their carriage were magnificent animals, specially trained for these events. They moved with precision, their hooves striking the pavement in rhythmic patterns. The sound echoed off the buildings, adding to the ceremonial atmosphere. Through the carriage windows, Catherine could see the crowds pressing against barriers. Security personnel struggled to maintain order as people surged forward, desperate for a closer look. She raised her hand in a wave, and the gesture was met with renewed cheering. William waved as well, his expression warm but controlled. He had done this countless times before, but never quite like this. Never as the Prince of Wales traveling in his father's coronation procession. The title felt new, even though he had known it would be his someday. They passed by centuries-old buildings, their architecture a testament to London's long history. Modern camera crews were set up on rooftops, capturing aerial footage of the procession. Helicopters circled overhead, the sound of their rotors adding to the cacophony. Catherine noticed an elderly woman in the crowd, tears streaming down her face as she waved a small flag. The woman looked to be in her 80s or 90s, perhaps old enough to remember the last coronation in 1953. How strange it must be, Catherine thought, to witness such history repeat itself after 70 years. A group of schoolchildren held up a banner that read, "Long live the King." Their faces were painted with Union Jack designs, and they jumped up and down with excitement. One little girl caught Catherine's eye and waved frantically. Catherine smiled and waved back, and the girl's face lit up with pure joy. These were the moments that mattered, Catherine had learned. Beyond all the protocol and ceremony, beyond the politics and criticism, there were real people who found meaning and connection in these royal traditions. For them, the monarchy represented continuity, stability, a link to their nation's past and future. The procession continued slowly, allowing ample time for spectators to see and photograph the royals. This was deliberate, part of the careful balance between security and accessibility. The monarchy existed because of public support, and public support required visibility. William looked at Catherine and saw the thoughtful expression on her face. He knew she was processing everything, analyzing the experience even as she lived it. This was one of her strengths, the ability to be present in the moment while also understanding its broader significance. The carriage turned onto the Mall, the grand boulevard leading to Buckingham Palace. This was perhaps the most iconic stretch of the route, lined with Union Jack flags strung between lampposts. The pink gravel pathway stretched ahead, leading toward the palace gates. Catherine could see Buckingham Palace in the distance, its facade grand and imposing. The building had been her husband's home in many ways, the place where he had grown up and learned what it meant to be royal. Now it would serve as the principal residence for his father, the newly crowned king. The crowds here were even denser if that was possible. People had claimed spots along the mall days in advance, camping out to ensure prime viewing positions. Their dedication was remarkable, their enthusiasm unwavering despite long hours of waiting. As they drew closer to the palace, Catherine felt a flutter of nervousness. Soon they would appear on the famous balcony, that iconic space where royal families had greeted the public for generations. It was one of the most photographed balconies in the world, and in minutes she would be standing on it as the Princess of Wales. The carriage passed through the palace gates and into the inner courtyard. Here, away from public view, they could finally relax slightly. Staff members waited to assist them, their faces familiar and welcome after the intensity of the public spectacle. William stepped out first, then turned to help Catherine. Her legs felt slightly unsteady after sitting for so long, and she was grateful for his support. They were ushered quickly inside the palace where other family members were already gathering. The children ran to them immediately. George maintained his composure, but Charlotte and Louis were less restrained. Catherine embraced them, grateful for the reminder of what mattered most. Beyond the crowns and ceremonies, beyond the public duties and responsibilities, they were still a family. King Charles entered the room, still in his full coronation regalia. The crown on his head caught the light, casting small rainbow reflections on the walls. He looked tired but satisfied, the weight of the day showing in his face. William approached his father and bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that felt both formal and necessary. Charles smiled and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. No words were needed. The touch conveyed everything: pride, love, gratitude for William's support. Camilla sat down carefully, her own crown still perched on her head. Staff members moved about efficiently, offering refreshments and making final preparations for the balcony appearance. This would be the last major public moment of the day, the image that would dominate newspaper front pages around the world. Catherine checked on George, making sure he was ready for another public appearance. He nodded seriously, his young face determined. She felt a surge of pride at his composure. He was handling everything with remarkable maturity. A palace official knocked on the door and announced that it was time. The family began to line up in the predetermined order. Charles and Camilla would stand in the center, with William and Catherine flanking them. The children would be positioned carefully, ensuring they were visible but protected. They walked through the palace corridors toward the balcony doors. The sounds of the crowd could be heard even from inside, a constant roar of anticipation. Thousands had gathered in front of the palace waiting for this traditional appearance. The doors to the balcony opened and the sound hit them like a physical wave. The crowd's roar was enormous, overwhelming, a wall of sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Catherine took a deep breath and stepped forward with William beside her. The view from the balcony was breathtaking. The Victoria Memorial stood in the foreground, its golden angel gleaming in the afternoon sun. Beyond it, the mall stretched away, packed solid with people. Every available space was filled, from the ground to windows of buildings. People even perched in trees for a better view. Charles and Camilla stood at the center of the balcony, the newly crowned king and queen acknowledging their subjects. The crown on Charles's head caught the sunlight, creating a brilliant display. He raised his hand in a wave, and the crowd's cheers somehow grew even louder. Catherine stood to their left with William, George between them. Charlotte held William's hand tightly, her eyes wide as she took in the massive crowd. Louis was on Catherine's other side, his small hand gripped firmly in hers. She could feel him trying to pull away, eager to explore, but she held firm. The photographers below went into a frenzy, their cameras creating a constant clicking sound like mechanical insects. Every major news organization in the world had representatives here, all competing for the perfect shot that would define the day. Catherine waved to the crowd, her smile genuine despite the surreal nature of the moment. She was standing on the Buckingham Palace balcony as the Princess of Wales, watching her father-in-law's coronation celebration, with thousands of people cheering below. If someone had told the young Kate Middleton this would be her life, she never would have believed them. William leaned down and said something to George. The boy nodded and waved more enthusiastically, clearly taking his father's guidance to heart. Catherine's heart swelled with love and pride. George was so young to carry such responsibility, but he was rising to the challenge with remarkable grace. The Red Arrows, the Royal Air Force's aerobatic team, suddenly appeared in the sky above. They flew in perfect formation, leaving trails of red, white, and blue smoke behind them. The crowd gasped collectively, then erupted in even louder cheers. It was a spectacular display, quintessentially British, the kind of pageantry that the nation excelled at. Catherine watched the planes fly past, their precision and coordination impressive. She thought about all the planning that had gone into this day, the countless people working behind the scenes to make everything perfect. From the florists who had spent the night decorating Westminster Abbey to the pilots now performing overhead, everyone had played their part. Louis started jumping up and down, excited by the planes. Catherine gently squeezed his hand, trying to calm him without making a scene. She knew that every movement, every gesture was being captured and analyzed. Parenting in public was one of the most challenging aspects of royal life. Charles turned and said something to William, a private word shared between father and son. William nodded, his expression serious. Catherine wondered what had been said. What private moment of connection had occurred in the midst of all this public spectacle? The family remained on the balcony for several more minutes, waving and acknowledging the crowd. This was an important ritual, a way of thanking the public for their support and celebrating the historic occasion together. The monarchy was nothing without the people, and moments like this reinforced that relationship. Finally, Charles indicated it was time to go inside. They filed back through the doors, and suddenly the sound of the crowd was muted. The contrast was jarring, like moving from bright sunlight into dim shade. Catherine's ears rang from the noise, and she felt suddenly exhausted. Inside, the family dispersed slightly. Staff members approached to help remove the heavier ceremonial pieces. Catherine felt relief as someone helped adjust her dress, which had been pinching uncomfortably. William loosened his collar slightly, a small gesture of relief that made her smile. The children were led away by their nanny, and Catherine felt a pang at their departure. But they needed rest, and there were still more official duties to attend to. A coronation was not just one ceremony, but a series of events that stretched throughout the day. Charles removed his crown and handed it carefully to an attendant. Without it, he looked suddenly older, more vulnerable. The crown had weight, both literal and metaphorical, and Catherine could see the toll it had taken. He sat down heavily in a nearby chair, accepting a glass of water gratefully. Camilla sat beside him, her own crown also removed. They looked at each other and shared a smile, a private moment of relief and satisfaction. They had done it. After all the years of waiting, all the controversy and challenge, Charles was now king, and Camilla was his queen. William sat down as well, and Catherine joined him. Her feet ached from standing in formal shoes, and her head hurt slightly from the weight of the tiara. But these were minor discomforts, easily endured for the significance of the day. A butler appeared with a tray of refreshments. Catherine accepted a cup of tea gratefully, the familiar warmth and taste grounding her after the extraordinary morning. William took a sandwich, suddenly aware that he had barely eaten since early that morning. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, each processing the experience in their own way. Outside, they could still hear the muffled sounds of the celebrating crowds. The party would continue for hours, but the immediate family needed this moment of quiet. Charles finally spoke, his voice tired but content. He thanked everyone for their support, for standing beside him on this momentous day. His words were simple but heartfelt, and Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes again. William stood and approached his father, placing a hand on his shoulder. The gesture was deeply moving, a son supporting his father, a future king honoring the present one. Charles looked up at William, and the love between them was evident. Catherine thought about family, about the complicated dynamics and pressures that came with being royal. But beneath all of that, they were still people who loved each other, who supported each other through difficult times. That was worth remembering, especially on days like this when the public spectacle could overshadow the personal relationships. The afternoon continued with various official meetings and receptions. Catherine changed into a different dress, something slightly less formal but still appropriate for meeting dignitaries. Her feet thanked her when she was able to switch to different shoes, even if they were still formal heels. William changed as well, grateful to be out of his heavy military uniform. They met back up in one of the palace's grand reception rooms, where heads of state and other important guests were gathering for a formal lunch. The room was magnificent, decorated in gold and cream with massive chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. Portraits of previous monarchs looked down from the walls, silent witnesses to this newest chapter in royal history. Catherine felt their painted eyes following her as she moved through the room. She made conversation with a prime minister from one Commonwealth nation, then a president from another. These were important diplomatic relationships, and her role was to be charming and engaged, while avoiding any potentially controversial topics. It was a delicate balance, one she had learned to navigate over years of practice. William was across the room, deep in conversation with a group of military leaders. He looked comfortable, confident in his element. He had served in the military himself and understood their world in ways that resonated with these men. Charles circulated through the room, no longer wearing his crown but still clearly the center of attention. People gravitated toward him, eager to offer congratulations and curry favor with the new king. He handled it all with practiced ease, decades of royal training showing in every interaction. Catherine excused herself from one conversation and moved to another. She spotted her parents across the room and caught her mother's eye. Carol gave her a small, encouraging smile. That simple gesture meant more than any elaborate compliment from a stranger. The formal luncheon stretched on for hours, course after course of elaborate food served on historic china. Catherine picked at her meal, her appetite limited by the nervous energy that still coursed through her body. Across the table, William caught her eye and gave her a small, supportive smile. The conversations around the table were carefully managed, with place cards ensuring that the right people sat near each other. Catherine found herself between a Commonwealth ambassador and a European royal, both of whom were pleasant but required her full attention. Every word she spoke could be analyzed, quoted, or misinterpreted, so she chose carefully. The ambassador asked about the children, a safe topic that Catherine could discuss freely. She spoke warmly about George's sense of responsibility, Charlotte's creativity, and Louis's boundless energy. The ambassador smiled, sharing stories of his own grandchildren. These human moments, Catherine had learned, were what made the endless formality bearable. Speeches began after the dessert course. Charles stood and addressed the assembled guests, thanking them for traveling from around the world to witness his coronation. His words were eloquent and heartfelt, touching on themes of service, duty, and the importance of the Commonwealth family. William was next, speaking as Prince of Wales for the first time in an official capacity. Catherine watched him with pride as he delivered his remarks without notes, his voice strong and confident. He spoke about his father's dedication, his lifetime of service that had prepared him for this moment. He also looked forward, acknowledging the challenges facing the world and the role the monarchy could play in addressing them. When William returned to his seat, he squeezed Catherine's hand under the table. She squeezed back, a private communication in the midst of very public circumstances. These small touches throughout the day had kept her grounded, reminded her that she was not alone in all of this. After the luncheon, there was a brief respite. Catherine and William returned to their private quarters in the palace, grateful for a moment away from cameras and crowds. Catherine kicked off her shoes and collapsed onto a sofa, her carefully maintained composure finally relaxing. William loosened his tie and sat beside her, equally exhausted. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, just breathing, just being themselves without the weight of public expectation. These moments were precious, increasingly rare as their responsibilities grew. Catherine thought about the evening ahead. There would be another balcony appearance at sunset, followed by a formal banquet for an even larger group of guests. Her feet already ached, and her face hurt from maintaining a smile for so many hours, but complaining felt wrong on a day of such historic significance. William seemed to read her thoughts. He asked if she was okay, genuine concern in his voice. Catherine nodded, managing a tired smile. She was okay. More than okay, really. She was living through history, playing a role in something bigger than herself. The exhaustion was temporary, but the memories would last forever. A knock on the door announced the arrival of their children. George, Charlotte, and Louis burst in, their energy renewed after their rest. They climbed onto the sofa, filling the space with their chatter and movement. Catherine embraced them, grateful for this reminder of what truly mattered. George asked questions about the ceremony, wanting to understand everything he had witnessed. William answered patiently, explaining the significance of various rituals and symbols. Catherine watched father and son together, seeing the careful way William was preparing George for his own future role. Charlotte showed her mother a drawing she had made of the coronation, with stick figures wearing crowns and lots of colorful flowers. Catherine praised it enthusiastically, genuinely moved by her daughter's artistic interpretation of the day. These were the kinds of memories she wanted her children to have, not just the formal ceremonies, but the family moments in between. Louis was less interested in talking about the coronation, and more interested in playing. He jumped on the sofa, his formal clothes now rumpled and his hair disheveled. Catherine gently tried to calm him, but William shook his head and smiled. "Let him be a child," his expression said. There would be plenty of time for formality later. All too soon it was time to prepare for the evening events. The children were taken back to their quarters, and Catherine reluctantly returned to getting ready. A hairdresser and makeup artist arrived to refresh her appearance, and she changed into yet another formal gown, this one in a deep blue that complemented her complexion. William dressed in a different formal suit, this one more appropriate for evening wear. They met back in the main corridor, each assessing the other's appearance with the critical eye that came from years of public life. Catherine straightened William's bow tie and he adjusted a strand of her hair that had fallen loose. They descended the grand staircase together, their hands linked. Below them, they could hear the sounds of guests arriving for the evening banquet. Hundreds of people would attend this event, filling the palace's largest staterooms with conversation and celebration. The evening was a blur of introductions and conversations. Catherine spoke with artists and activists, with scientists and scholars, with people from all walks of life who had been invited to celebrate this historic day. Each conversation required focus and engagement, even as her energy flagged. William stayed close, a protective presence that she appreciated. When she looked tired, he would find a way to steer them toward a quieter corner for a brief respite. When someone was particularly tedious, he would catch her eye and she would know he understood. They had developed this silent language over years together, a way of communicating that required no words. The banquet dinner was even more elaborate than the luncheon had been. Multiple courses of exquisite food, each paired with carefully selected wines. Catherine ate sparingly, aware that she would need to maintain her composure for several more hours. Entertainment was provided between courses. A renowned tenor sang arias from famous operas. A string quartet played classical pieces. The atmosphere was elegant and refined, befitting the significance of the occasion. Charles and Camilla sat at the head table, the focus of everyone's attention. They looked tired but happy, basking in the success of the day. Camilla caught Catherine's eye at one point and gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. They had both married into this family, both learned to navigate its complexities. There was an understanding between them, a recognition of shared experience. As the evening drew on, preparations began for the final balcony appearance. This would be at sunset, timed to coincide with a fireworks display over the Thames. The symbolism was clear, the sun setting on one era and rising on another, the continuity of the monarchy displayed in light and color. The family gathered once again, the children rejoining them for this final public moment. They were tired now, the long day evident in their drooping eyes and quiet voices, but they rallied, understanding that this last appearance was important. They walked back through the palace corridors, retracing steps they had taken earlier. The building felt different now, quieter despite the guests still present. There was a sense of the day winding down, of approaching its natural conclusion. The balcony doors opened once more, and they stepped out into the cool evening air. The crowd had changed throughout the day, but thousands still remained, determined to see every moment of the historic occasion. Their cheers rose to greet the royal family, enthusiastic despite the long hours of waiting. The sun was low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful, a natural backdrop to the human ceremony below. Catherine stood with her family and waved to the crowd, feeling the weight of the day settle on her shoulders. The fireworks began with a single bright explosion, a burst of gold that illuminated the darkening sky, then another, and another, until the entire sky seemed to be alive with color and light. The crowd below gasped and cheered, their faces upturned to watch the spectacular display. Catherine felt Louis grip her hand tighter, excited but also slightly frightened by the loud booms echoing across London. She pulled him closer, protective instinct overriding royal protocol. Charlotte pressed against William's side, her eyes wide with wonder at the colorful explosions above. George stood straighter, trying to maintain the composure expected of him even as his young face showed his excitement. Catherine's heart ached for him, for the way he always had to be so careful, so controlled. She hoped he would have opportunities to just be a child, to experience wonder without worrying about how it looked to others. The fireworks continued for nearly 15 minutes, a choreographed display that must have cost a fortune and taken months to plan. Rockets soared into the sky, exploding in patterns of stars and flowers. Catherine recognized the final sequence was timed to the national anthem, the bursts of light creating a visual symphony that left the crowd in awe. When the last firework faded, a moment of silence fell over the crowd. Then the cheering erupted again, even louder than before. This was the culmination of the day, the final celebration of King Charles III's coronation. Tomorrow, life would return to something resembling normal. But tonight, this moment belonged to history. Charles raised both hands in acknowledgement of the crowd's enthusiasm. Beside him, Camilla waved gracefully, her posture perfect despite what must have been considerable fatigue. They had been performing for public consumption since early morning, maintaining flawless composure throughout. The family waved one final time, then turned to go back inside. As the doors closed behind them, Catherine felt a sense of relief wash over her. The public portion of the day was finally over. Now they could let down their guard at least a little. Inside, the atmosphere immediately relaxed. Staff members approached to help them with various needs, but there was a sense of celebration among the workers too. They had pulled off an enormous logistical challenge, managing thousands of details to create a flawless coronation day. The children were taken to bed, exhausted, and past ready for sleep. Catherine kissed each of them goodnight, holding them a moment longer than usual. They had been so brave today, so composed and well-behaved. She was intensely proud of all three of them. William stood nearby saying his own goodnights to the children. When they were gone, he turned to Catherine and let out a long breath. His expression was a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The day had been long for everyone, but for him, watching his father crowned king carried additional emotional weight. They made their way to a smaller reception room where close family members were gathering. The formal requirements of the day were over, and this was a chance for the family to be together without cameras or crowds. Just people who loved each other, celebrating a significant milestone. Charles had removed his formal attire and was dressed in more comfortable clothes. He looked 10 years younger without the weight of ceremonial robes and crown. He greeted William and Catherine warmly, pulling his son into an embrace that was rare in their typically formal relationship. Catherine watched the two men together and felt tears threaten again. This was what mattered, she thought, not the ceremony or the crown or the public spectacle, but these relationships between people who had committed their lives to something larger than themselves. Camilla sat in a comfortable chair, her shoes kicked off, a glass of champagne in her hand. She looked tired but content, and she raised her glass to Catherine in a small toast. Catherine accepted a glass from a passing server and returned the gesture. They had both survived the day with grace. The conversation was relaxed, filled with observations and anecdotes from various parts of the day. Someone mentioned the moment when a page boy had nearly tripped, and everyone laughed, the tension of the day finally releasing. They talked about the weather holding, about unexpected but pleasant encounters with various guests, about the children's behavior. Catherine found herself sitting next to Pippa, her sister providing a welcome connection to her pre-royal life. Pippa asked how she was really doing, and Catherine answered honestly that she was exhausted but also exhilarated. Days like this reminded her why the monarchy mattered, why all the sacrifice and difficulty were worthwhile. Michael and Carol Middleton sat together, still somewhat overwhelmed by the day's events. Catherine caught her father's eye and smiled. He had walked her down the aisle when she married William, and now he had watched her participate in a coronation as Princess of Wales. His pride was evident in his expression. William came to sit beside Catherine, handing her a fresh glass of champagne. They clinked glasses quietly, a private toast between husband and wife. She leaned against his shoulder, suddenly feeling the full weight of her exhaustion. He put his arm around her, a protective gesture that felt wonderful. Charles stood to make an informal toast. He thanked everyone for their support, not just today but throughout the years leading to this moment. He spoke about duty and service, about the privilege and burden of the crown, about hope for the future. His words were simple but moving, and Catherine felt tears slip down her cheeks. When Charles finished, William stood as well. He spoke about his father's example, about the lessons learned watching Charles navigate the challenges of being heir for so many decades. He promised to serve with the same dedication when his own time came. Catherine squeezed his hand, silently pledging her own commitment. The gathering continued for another hour, but gradually people began to drift away. The day had been long and beds were calling. Catherine and William finally excused themselves, making their way through the quiet palace corridors toward their own quarters. In the privacy of their room, Catherine finally allowed herself to completely relax. She sat at her dressing table and began removing the formal jewelry and makeup, her hands moving through familiar motions. William loosened his collar and sat on the edge of the bed, watching her in the mirror. They talked quietly about the day, processing everything they had experienced. The good moments and the challenging ones. The things that had gone perfectly and the small hiccups that no one else had probably noticed. It was important to debrief together, to share the experience and their reactions to it. Catherine thought about all the people who had participated in making the day successful, the security teams who had worked for months to ensure safety, the event planners who had coordinated thousands of details, the florists, the musicians, the caterers, the drivers, the staff members who had made everything run smoothly. It took an army of people to create what had appeared to be effortless pageantry. She thought about the crowds who had waited for hours just to catch a glimpse of the procession. What motivated such dedication? Was it patriotism, curiosity, or something else? Whatever it was, their presence had added to the day's significance. A coronation without crowds would feel empty, pointless even. William came to stand behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. He met her eyes in the mirror and smiled. They had done well today, his expression said. They had played their parts with dignity and grace. She smiled back, grateful for his partnership in all of this. Finally ready for bed, Catherine slipped between the cool sheets and sighed with relief. Her body ached from standing and walking in formal shoes, from maintaining perfect posture for hours on end. But it was a good ache, the kind that came from meaningful effort. William joined her and they lay together in the darkness, holding hands and listening to the distant sounds of London outside their windows. Somewhere parties were still happening, people still celebrating the coronation, but here in this private space they could finally rest. Catherine's mind drifted through images from the day. The moment of the crowning when time seemed to stop, the faces in the crowd so varied and yet united in their attention. The children's bravery, George's serious expression, Charlotte's wonder, Louis's barely contained energy. William beside her through it all, steady and supportive. She thought about her own journey, from a middle-class girl in Berkshire to this moment, lying beside the future king in Buckingham Palace after witnessing a coronation. Life had taken her to places she never could have imagined, challenged her in ways she hadn't expected, but also rewarded her with experiences few people would ever know. The role of Princess of Wales carried enormous responsibility. Diana had shown both the heights and depths of what the title could mean. Catherine was determined to honor that legacy while also creating her own path. She would use her platform for good, support causes she believed in, and most importantly, raise her children with love and wisdom. Beside her, William's breathing had deepened into sleep. The day had taken its toll on him too, though he would never complain. Catherine listened to his steady breathing and felt grateful for his presence in her life. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, just as they had today.